Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us again. Another one of our Safer at Home series talks. Pleasure to have you. Before I forget, I want to wish everyone a happy Easter, happy Passover, happy spring, whatever it is that you celebrate. I realize it's now our second COVID Easter, but we're plowing through it. Things are getting better. I'm telling you, things are getting better. Humor me and tell me things are getting better. A couple things before we get started tonight. As you know, all our talks are brought to you by our sponsors, Cape Cod 5, First Citizens Federal Credit Union, and Martha's Vineyard Savings. And all of our books are available at Eight Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth. So we hope that you participate in the local economy. If you want to get a copy of tonight's book, it's at Eight Cousins. And I'm really looking forward to this because this is a little different talk. Our speaker tonight is coming to us from New Mexico, and as Bettye Kearse will tell you, she's got her PhD in biology from NYU. She used to live in Boston. She's now in New Mexico, but this is essentially a written version of an oral history, and one that I will fully confess, as I talked with her before, we'd certainly had heard about Thomas Jefferson, but I never really heard about James Madison. And I'm really honored that she's with us tonight. Would you welcome our guest tonight, Bettye Kearse?
Thank you, Mark. I am very pleased to have the opportunity to tell my story to the patrons of the Museum on the Green. The title of my talk is The Other Madisons in Search of Mandy. Griots, women, and griots, men, carry forth the stories of their ancestors. For thousands of years, possibly before the birth of Christ, generations of West African griots and griots have served as human links between past and present by speaking the stories of their ancestors and the history of their people. But they are more than genealogists and historians. They are also teachers, spokespersons, judges, advisors, exhorters, musicians, poets, and praise singers, just to name only a few of their many, many functions. They shape how each person sees himself in the present and in the continuum of past and future. Their words preserve the values and beliefs of entire cultures. And when Africans were stolen and enslaved, they did not leave their tradition of oral history behind. For many African American families like mine, this tradition is all we have that preserves the legacies our ancestors left for us. Without it, I would not know that I am a descendant of the enslaved cook, Corinne, and her enslaver and half-brother, President James Madison. Madison did not have children with his wife, Dolly, so many scholars believe he was either impotent, infertile, or both. But the oral history of my family says that James Madison Jr., a founding father of our nation, was also a founding father of my African American family. For more than 200 years, our family credo, always remember, you're a Madison you come from African slaves and a president, has been a source of inspiration and pride, but it started as a mere tool. According to the history told by the 8 generations of my family's American griots and griots, Madison became attracted to his half sister Corinne, and around 1794, that attraction led to the birth of a son, my great great grandfather, my great 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 grandfather, Jim. Shortly after the end of the War of 1812, Dolly Madison, having learned that Jim and one of her nieces were in love, had just sold Jim. As he was being taken away, Corinne pleaded with Jim, always remember, you're a Madison. She believed the name could help them find each other someday, but they never saw each other again. Yet Jim remembered his mother's words and passed them on to his children and told them to tell their children that they are Madisons. Over the generations, as America changed, the credo changed. After our enslaved ancestors, by then living in Texas, learned that they were free, they no longer needed the name as just a tool to find torn away loved ones. Now they could also use the name as a source of inspiration. Jim's son, Emmanuel, my great great grandfather, taught his children to be proud that their name had come from a president and to make the most of that legacy now that they had the chance. Emmanuel changed the credo to always remember, you're a Madison, you come from a president. 2 generations and some 40 years later, Emmanuel's grandson, John Chester, my beloved Gramps, who was born free, was proud that his father, grandfather, and other enslaved ancestors had overcome enslavement. Gramps, my family's 6th generation griot, wanted his children to understand that enslaved people were remarkable individuals who possessed inner strength and a sense of their humanity and a sense of hope, which enabled them to survive enslavement. But they also had many talents by which they contributed tremendously to America. So Gramps added 2 important words, African slaves. The credo became, always remember, you're a Madison. You come from African slaves and a president. So for the last 100 years, the credo has reminded us that we aren't just descendants of a president. We are descendants of enslaved people too. In 1990, when my mother, the 7th generation griot, turned over to me the old cardboard box of family memorabilia, I became the 8th generation griot. When I asked her, why now? She answered in her slight Texan drawl, I want to give you plenty of time to write the book. I can probably write a book about our history, I thought, but I cannot be the one to hold up the torch of family pride. For many years, I had wondered why, or even whether the credo should make me proud. For me, it resounded with the abuses of slavery. I decided that to become the kind of griot I hoped I could be, I would confront the discomforting parts of my family's story. Now, you've just heard about Corinne, the enslaved woman who had the relationship with James Madison Jr. and who started the credo. But let's go one generation back. The story actually started with Corinne's mother, a stolen woman called Mandy. Mandy was my family's first African ancestor in America and our first griot. Mandy told Corinne, who told Jim, who told Emmanuel, who told my great-grandfather Mac, who told my grandfather, who told my mother, who told me, who tells her daughter Nicole, who tells my grandchildren, Peter and Madison, that she, Mandy, was stolen from the shore near her village in Ghana, carried across the ocean in the bowels of a wretched ship, shoved onto an auction block, sold, put to work in a small cotton field in a remote corner of a huge tobacco farm, and then raped by her enslaver, James Madison Sr. Corinne was born of those forced encounters, making her and the future president half siblings. This slide shows part of the whole family tree I showed you a little bit ago. And okay, so it shows that Corinne's mother was Mandy, and Corinne's father was James Madison Sr. And it also shows that James Madison Jr.'s mother was Nellie Conway, and his father was also James Madison Sr. So James Madison Jr. and Corinne were half siblings. Mandy had endured all that she endured and witnessed what happened to her own daughter. But I believed that by knowing Mandy deeply and walking where she had walked and seeing what she had seen would help me to become an unflinching griot who understood and had reconciled all that the credo is saying. So in 1992, I began my journey of discovery of my ancestors, our country, and myself. I traveled to Lagos, Portugal, where the transatlantic slave trade began, to Ghana, West Africa, where Mandy was born, to Baltimore, Maryland, where a replica of a slave ship like the one that carried Mandy away from home sits in a museum, to Bastrop and Travis counties in central Texas, where my great-great-grandparents and their 6 sons learned that eight sons learned that they were free. And I went to New York City, where an 18th century African burial ground had recently been discovered. But my journeys began and ended at Montpelier, James Madison's former plantation in Virginia, where Mandy labored and died. My travels taught me that wherever African slaves once walked, history had buried their footsteps. At the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, as slave ships sailed along, under a gaudy concession stand in Portugal, beneath a federal building near Wall Street, among the ashes of burned documents and personal papers in courthouses and in private homes. And beneath a brick walkway and in unmarked graves at Montpelier. And their footsteps had disappeared into the sand along the west coast of Africa as looming slave ships waited to take millions of kidnapped Africans away from their homeland forever. On my first visit to Montpelier, I parked at the visitor center across the road and took the shuttle bus through a wooded landscape. When the bus rounded a curve, the mansion, a stately coral-colored jewel set before a sweep of hovering trees, came into view. The moment I set foot on the soil where my ancestors had walked some 200 years earlier, I felt that I belonged there with them and that they and this place would help me to become the griot I wanted to be. I started off on a guided tour with a group of visitors, but I asked so many questions about slavery on the plantation that the guide directed me to Lynn Lewis, the chief archaeologist. She was suntanned and had short blonde hair, and the knees of her blue jeans were stained with Virginia's red soil. When I told her my family story, Lynn said, "Let me show you something special." She took me to the rear of the mansion and pointed out a path of bare soil about 3 inches deep and a foot or so wide that ran between the rear entry of the mansion and an excavation site about 70 feet away. When we reached the site, Lynn knelt down and pulled back a tarp. Beneath it lay an irregular open rectangle of bricks at one end of what had been the foundation for a small building. Shoving her hands into the pockets of her Levi's and swaying back and forth on her heels, Lynn said in her raspy voice, "This was the kitchen, and that heap of bricks is what's left of the cooking hearth. And the path was worn into the ground as generations of enslaved cooks walked to and from the mansion, serving the Madisons and their multitude of guests." But what I saw was more than a hole in the ground and a heap of bricks. And the path was something extraordinary. My great, 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 great grandmother Corrine had walked this path. I stepped into the furrow and followed the length of it, a visible, tangible, and symbolic tether that had held her in bondage. My eyes teared. I had not expected to walk so literally in the footsteps of an ancestor. There were no walls and no roofs at the site now, but seeing where the kitchen had stood and recalling the stories I knew so well, I felt the tears flow. This might have been where James Madison Jr. became attracted to Corinne, and where not far away she had stood helpless while Dolly sent Jim away. The visit was taking its toll on me, but I said to Lynn, I really should see where my enslaved ancestors are buried. Not a good idea, she cautioned. First of all, the gravesites do not have any names or dates on them. And besides, I would not recommend you go there in those shorts and sandals. There's lots of poison ivy. Overwhelmed and tired by being in the same place where 3 of my ancestors had been held in bondage, 2 of them raped and 1 sold, I was relieved not to go. Next time, I promised. Next time. 3 years later, I was in Ghana, West Africa. Chapter 9 of The Other Madisons, The Castle, begins with my favorite sentence in the whole book. I'd like to read that sentence and a portion of what follows to you. The blue of the African sky was the most perfect color God ever made. The air was so clear and the sunlight danced so brightly off the ocean. I felt as though I was standing inside a crystal, where the ocean swept over the beach. The soft golden sand became firm and copper colored. I ventured into the water and it curled over my feet, soothing away the heat of that African day. I stepped back onto the dry sand and turned to watch the water gather up my wet footprints, taking them into the ocean's depths, disappearing westward as others had gone. It was 1995, 3 years after my first visit to Virginia, and I had come to Ghana with a group from my church. My aim was to trace Mandy's footsteps from Africa to America. I stood on the shore, my shoulders hot under the powerful rays of the sun, and looked up at Elmina Castle. Built by the Portuguese in 1482, it stretched along the shoreline and rose out of the rocks like a white crown. The series of spires and tiers of balconies and walls, embellished with arches and studded with cannons. Long canoes painted with bright colors and bold designs crowded into the small harbor, alive with music, voices, and fishing nets flopping against the sides of the boats. Beautiful, in spite of its history. Elmina, Ghana. In the central courtyard, I joined a group of visitors from distant parts of the world. I was surprised when our guide, in his melodic, punctuated baritone, informed us that the building at the center with its square facade and square windows, was a church, the first Catholic church in sub-Saharan Africa. But when the Protestant Dutch took over in 1637, they refused to worship in a Catholic church and began to use the building to buy and sell goods and slaves. In the system of dark tunnels and dungeons below the courtyard, thousands upon thousands of Africans had been chained together, imprisoned shoulder to shoulder, until weeks later, herded like cattle, they were herded like cattle onto ships that would carry them to enslavement in the New World. Near the church, there was a small cell set aside for condemned slaves, most often men who resisted their captivity. There was only a handful of us on the tour, but when the heavy door slammed shut behind us, enclosing us in utter darkness, I felt crushed between hundreds of bodies. The sound of each person's breath echoed hollow in the tight room. In the dark, our tour guide revealed what had happened here. 10 or 12 men at a time, he said in almost a whisper, were whipped, bludgeoned, and shackled, and then dragged into the cell. The door was locked. No food, no water. Every few days, armed guards would look through a small opening in the door to check the condition of the prisoners, but still, no food and no water. The guards came back until one by one, every prisoner was dead. Our docent's soft, rhythmic voice was like a hymn of mourning wafting from the church across the courtyard. On the other side of the courtyard, there had been a holding area for female captives. The guard pointed up to a balcony and told us of a tradition at Elmina. Because there were few European prostitutes in Africa, when a white man wanted a woman, he chose one of the female captives. The Dutch governor had first choice. He would order his soldiers to bring a group of prospects to the area of the courtyard below his living quarters. The governor would step onto his balcony, survey the women below, and point to the one he wanted. With everyone looking on, the guards dunked her again and again into a cistern of water until she was clean enough for the governor to touch. Then the guards pushed and prodded the woman up a narrow stairway and through a trap door that opened directly into the governor's bedroom above. The trap door was then closed and locked. It was the 20th century, and I had come to Elmina on my own accord. But as I stood in the courtyard, I could not help but envision myself among a score of captive African women huddled together under the governor's gaze. We were all thin and weak following days of hunger and thirst, but our bodies were tall or petite, narrow-hipped or broad. Our breasts were small, full, erect, or flaccid. Our faces were round or slender, our foreheads low or high, our cheeks were smooth or etched with tribal markings. Some of us cried, others frowned. Some of us cowered and trembled. Some of us tried to hide our nakedness. Others knew that trying to hide was useless. In my imagination, we had short cropped hair or rows of braids or intricate hair designs interlaced with beads. Our beads were yellow or blue or green or orange, or like Mandy's, our beads were red. In reality, I was a free American woman, but the anguish, the fear, the sense of loss, the sorrow, all lodged in my chest. When the time came to board the ship, the women who had survived were led through an interconnecting series of rooms until they reached the one that offered the only light many had seen for weeks. Blinded by the light, the women entered a narrow gated egress that led out to the beach. The intensely blue sky draped their heads, but maybe the women glimpsed loved ones as their eyes adjusted to the brightness. They had walked through, stumbled through, crawled through, or fallen through the gate of no return. Beyond it, they could feel something familiar under their feet. African sand. But only moments later, the sensation was lost forever. The ocean wiped away their footprints. When I returned to Montpelier 5 years after my first visit, Lynn Lewis was at an excavation site, so I waited on the front portico. Though the April weather in the foothills of Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains had been erratic, on the day of my return, the sky was clear and blue, and the sun was just beginning to warm the morning air. The distant, densely forested mountains that spread out before me were blue, almost purple, and so wide they wrapped around the horizon. Spring here, I thought, was alluring with its promise of warmth and sense of awakening. But Montpelier had been a prison. Once scores of slave cabins lay south of the mansion, and I pictured them scattered low on the hillside, leaning perilously, their weathered roofs slowly giving way to the pull of the dusty earth, succumbing to the forces of the land. And I pictured enslaved people, diminutive in the distance fields, their labor coaxing the riches from the soil, making possible the Madison legacy. I went to the back of the mansion, hoping to step again into the furrow where Corinne had walked, where together she and I had followed a visible dusty red path through landscape that had once held Black human beings hostage. The path was gone. A brick walkway now covered Corinne's footsteps, burying my physical connection to my enslaved ancestor. I felt alone and lost. Lynn found me wandering aimlessly. "Sorry to keep you waiting," she said. "No problem," I murmured. I did not mention Corinne's buried footsteps. Silently, we headed toward the slave cemetery. Scattered pebbles on the dirt road glistened in the morning sunlight, and wide meadows speckled with young daffodils sloped green and bold. But as Lynn and I walked from the mansion, I grew more and more afraid I would see an isolated patch of dry dirt with clusters of dandelions and poison ivy, a place where enslaved individuals in death, as in life, had been dishonored. Bursts of wind made the trees shuddered. I huddled into my jacket. "I'm sure at least one of my ancestors lies buried here," I said, trying to reconnect to them. Lynn and I walked toward a low hill that rose behind a cluster of trees. A moment later, Lynn said, "This is it." The field of bright blue periwinkles took me by surprise. We stepped off the dirt road and entered a small woods. Blanketed with fallen leaves and cradling the hidden remains, the ground was soft underfoot. "It's because of these periwinkles," Lynn said, pointing towards the perky flowers, "that we know this is a burial ground. Back then, folks in the South planted them to pretty up their cemeteries. And under the leaves, we found linear depressions, all oriented east to west, where the graves had sunk a little. Then last winter, there was an early thaw, and the only snow left was in the depressions. It was eerie and beautiful." Lynn guided me further in, careful we did not kick the headstones and footstones, which were crude blocks of white quartz. We stood in a kingdom of many trees, but only one of them called to me. I approached it, reverent. The trunk was broad, the thick branches pregnant with pale leaf buds. Nestled at the base was a stone the color of raw flesh, its uneven surface shiny and smooth. The stories passed down through my mother had set me on the path that led to this very spot. I knelt down and touched the rock, and I envisioned my family's first griot lying beneath, wrapped in white muslin, a single red bead in the palm of her hand. The gentle morning sun was warm on my back, countering the chill in the air. My shadow fell over the rock, uniting me with my family's matriarch, our five greats, my five greats grandmother. Mandy's hands sowed and reaped the southern soil for someone else, bringing them riches. Mandy's womb gave birth to generations of descendants, her own riches. And Mandy's heart gave those descendants the ability to believe in themselves so that they could become farmers, carpenters, teachers, civic leaders, entrepreneurs, lawyers, dentists, doctors, nurses, social workers, engineers, homemakers, writers, psychologists, ministers, railroad porters, musicians, artists, and much, much more. In the 7 years since receiving the box from my mother, I had struggled to understand why or even whether the credo should make me proud. But I had become a griot who will not let her footsteps be buried. And I believe that through the book I have written, I found a way to make the world pay attention to Mandy. I will always remember I'm a Madison and that I come from a president. Madison did great things for the nation I love. But it is Mandy, a stolen and enslaved woman, who is my inspiration. It is Mandy who makes me proud. I looked up from the stone and said to Lynn with absolute confidence, I have found Mandy. Thank you.
Thank you, Bettye. Wow. If you have any questions, use the chat feature down below. Wow. You preface it by saying at the top of your remarks that you, if I get the phraseology right, that you thought back to the African-American slaves, and I think you used the word that you were angry, you were hurt, this, as you went through this experience, and being handed a box of stories and family papers, and then it's your task to write it down, and you travel to these places, unlike Alex Haley, because I think we'll listen to it and we're all thinking roots, but you knew where to go. You knew that you knew where to start. What did you still feel angry? Did you still what went through your mind and all these little different steps as you're putting this to paper? And was there ever any, I know there wasn't other children from James and Dolly, but was there ever any pushback from other people saying that this is just not so? I mean, I find it fascinating and really enthralling that Lynn was as supportive as she was of you. There was no pushback, that she wanted to help you with this. So as you're putting this to paper, what's going through your head, and what are your feelings today as opposed to what they were at the start of the 1990s when you began this?
Well, during my travels, I had a lot of feelings. I was angry that people did this to people, for centuries. Such cruelty and on such a massive scale, and for such a long time. I did feel angry, but there was, also a lot of sorrow because of the people who were stolen and who lost everything they knew and everything they loved, and who lost their freedom and ended up enslaved, and you know gave birth to descendants who were also enslaved. So that's answers, I think, part of your question. I don't know if I remember all the whole question, but you mentioned when I went to Montpelier and I met Lynn Lewis, and Lynn was very happy to hear my family story. And it was just an incredible coincidence that they had just located the South Kitchen and were in the process of excavating it. And my ancestor Corrine was uh, a cook, so Corrine had worked there, and they liked kind of filling in the story with some details about real people who had worked at this site that they were working on. And but more than just the site that they were working on, the staff in Montpelier is very committed to learning the whole story. So I have gone back to Montpelier many, many times. I don't even know how many times. And every person on that staff, from the archaeologists to the historians, to some of the administrators, to oh, I just I'm blanking on the name of a specific person who has a unique role, but um, the archivist. I'm sorry, that was the word that I was looking for. But every single one of them has welcomed me and has done everything they could to help me. So I have gained nothing but incredible support from the staff of Montpelier. So can you refresh me about other parts of your question? I just I should have
I'm,
taken
I'm,
notes, but I
I'm not even sure I articulated it well. I think you blew me out of the water with the story. I think I was stumbling in my own words. As Deb Seeger just wrote, because that was amazing, fascinating, and humbling. Thank you so beautiful for so beautifully articulating the very sad and incredible story. It was, and truthfully, I'm not even sure I can remember what I was asking, but it's like, I how have your emotions changed from when you first started to today? You were handed, you became a griot. You're what, eighth generation, I think. That you're handed this box of family papers, and you've now put pen to paper and put it in a book. As you went through this metamorphosis, that you're the one that found Mandy's grave, you're the one that went back and in to Africa, to Virginia, to all these little places, all these stops along the way. How have you changed, and how have your feelings changed since this began for you?
I would say I changed considerably as a person. I grew up kind of pampered and protected, and I, I didn't have to endure any type of deprivation whatsoever. But as I when I became the griot and started doing research for the book, I became aware there was part of my own history that I had no understanding of. And so that's why it was important for me to travel to these places to actually be where my ancestors were. And I changed also by recognizing how strong these people were, enslaved people, particularly the women, because it's the women who were raped, and it's the women who had children by their slave masters and other men as well, not just the men who owned them. And they knew that those children that they gave birth to could be sold, and probably were sold. And the women, you know, I'm sure they were devastated, but they survived. And they may have gone through the same thing repeatedly.
We know that in Jefferson's lifetime, it was fairly well understood that he had had a relationship with Sally Hemings. I mean, but it doesn't seem that people knew about James Madison having relations with his slave until after he died. Did your work seem to catch some people a little flat-footed, or were they? Or, I mean, I'm glad that the Montpelier staff was as accepting and as helpful as they were, but were other academics taken a little by surprise by this, or not? Not really. I mean, have you gotten any kind of pushback?
I have, well, I haven't really encountered any academics except for those at Montpelier who are supportive, and I've met some at the University of Virginia who are also supportive, University of Tennessee who are supportive, and some other Southern universities, but I haven't, there's not a lot of them. I would say maybe a half dozen of them. And I think that there are certain, in fact, I'm certain that there are those who are disbelieving. And I have met white Madison descendants, and two in particular have been very welcoming and call me cousin. And one of them, oddly enough, I met her in Santa Fe. The other one, which was really quite a surprise, and she's a descendant of one of Madison's sisters. And I met another descendant of one of Madison's sisters at Montpelier. But those two women are welcoming, and we call each other cousin. Others, I have met others, particularly those who are active members of the National Society of Madison Family Descendants. And while they were never rude to me, they were just not interested in being helpful. So those are the doubters, I'm sure.
Well, I think the people that have watched all our different virtual talks, I usually have this list of questions. And I have to say, this is the first time I was kind of sat there wide-mouthed and tears in my eyes, and I don't have my usual list of questions, but you blew me out of the water with that. So I applaud you for that one. Again, if anybody's got any questions, use the chat. I think I think I'm speaking for a lot of people that you really really moved us with that story. What is there a follow-up for you for this, or have you done what you wanted to do? Did you feel you've accomplished what it is that your mother charged you to do?
Well, I think I've probably gone beyond what my mother was intending me to do. When she asked me to write the book, she intended for me to write down the stories to make sure that they would not be forgotten. She was concerned as that what we got, as the years went by, as we got farther and farther away from what our enslaved ancestors had endured, and also what her grandfather, father, and she herself had endured during Jim Crow. So I don't know if I said the word during slavery at first, but and so long ago we were enslaved people, and more, not all that long ago, but then after that we were under Jim Crow. But as we got further and further away from the slavery era and the Jim Crow era, she was concerned that our family would become comfortable with our lives and forget the stories. So she wanted it written down. And it became clear that our family story should become part of America's story. So that has, I mean, I think that has been accomplished. But my next project is I want to write a version that's appropriate for young adults, so that young people can read it and kind of chew on it and think about it for themselves. This book is actually written for them, but I envision the audience as being their parents. But I think the next step is to write the book for the young people themselves. And I also want to write a children's picture book, which would probably be more about the importance of oral history, using my family as an example.
Got a question here. How do you think the future will view our story, your story, this story?
I think the future will view America's story as being more complete for having my family story and other family stories as well as part of America's story.
Oh, well, I want to thank you for doing this tonight. This has been truly memorable and fantastic. This was great, and so thank you for doing this. Thank you for taking your mom's directive a little further maybe than she was directing, but for doing this, for telling us, for articulating it so well, and your use of PowerPoint with your story was great, and your reading was fabulous. So thank you for taking the time, for coming to us from New Mexico. The name of the book is The Other Madisons. Her name is Bettye Kearse. Thank you for doing this tonight, for joining us. Thank you everybody for joining it, and continued good success. And I'm looking forward to the next book.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.